When I was little, my grandparents used to tell me all kinds of stories they had enjoyed when they were young. One of my favorites was called Stone Soup. They didn't always tell it the same way, but the important details were always there, and the meaning was always clear. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. A traveling man happened upon a small farm on the edge of a small village where a girl and her younger brother were doing chores in the yard. The man asked the children to tell their parents they had a visitor, but upon learning the parents weren't home, he asked for some help preparing a meal. The children thought the man was a vagrant begging for food. They sadly explained that it hadn't been a good year for farmers and their pantry was awfully bare. It hadn't been a good year for anyone really, and there was little of anything to be had even in the village. They were about to turn the man away when he informed them that he had a very special stone which, when properly used, would make a wonderful soup that everyone could enjoy. He showed them a small, ordinary-looking stone and told them if they would put their biggest pot on to boil and bring him a ladle to stir it with, he'd show them how it worked. The children, skeptical but curious as children always are, complied, bringing out a pot that was nearly as big as they were. The man filled it with water, put it over a cooking fire, and dropped in his stone. They watched for a moment before the man tasted the soup and announced that it was coming along nicely, but what it really needed was some salt. Quickly the children brought him some, as he had asked, and it was added to the pot. As the last of it was sprinkled in, the trio was greeted by the children's neighbor, Mrs. Kipitzer, who had spied the stranger and the children cooking together and had come over to satisfy her curiosity. When she heard the explanation for what they were doing, she insisted, "You can't make a soup without a good broth. I've got a soup bone you can use if you'll share a bit of your soup." And before anyone could answer her, she ran off to fetch it. On her way back to her door, she practically ran over another neighbor, Mr. Keene, who had also seen the stranger but thought he could get a better glimpse from her front yard. Upon learning soup was being made, Mr. Keene declared that such a task could not be done without turnips, and while he had little else in his pantry, he could certainly spare a few of those if the children and their friend would be willing to share some of their soup. As you have probably guessed, even if you haven't heard it, the story goes on in this vein for several ingredients, with one villager providing seasoning, another some vegetables, and a returning hunter deciding he could certainly spare a cut of his prize if the now fairly large group would share the soup that smelled so delicious with his family. The children's parents arrived home to find the entire village gathered on their front lawn and their biggest pot filled to nearly boiling over with a hot meal good enough to quell any concerns they might have about what was going on. By this time, the villagers had figured out the clever traveler's trick, but also realized that he had done them a service. He'd inspired the whole village to come together to solve their hunger problem by bartering ingredients to be added to the soup in trade for a portion of it. They had worked together, socialized, enjoyed themselves, anticipated the reward, and then experienced it, and the traveler enjoyed his part of the meal, collected his stone, and moved on. This is one of my favorite stories about community because it describes one of the most important aspects, colleagueship or partnership in the community. It's a story about voluntary altruistic collaboration among community members in the interest of problem solving, dealing with common hardship, and marshaling and stewarding community resources. The community members in the story initially acted out of concern for their neighbors' children, but remained to pitch in and work on their project. As the story progresses, it becomes about using labor and trade to provide a resource that will be appreciated by the entire community. Utility workers who often take great risks and always have to display great reliability in exchange for their pay, who provide their communities with water, electricity, natural gas, communications services, and waste removal services, are a real-life example of this. Their profession involves taking responsibility for the welfare of their communities and letting that responsibility define and steer a major aspect of their lives. That sense of responsibility can manifest in other ways, in rescue and cleanup after a disaster strikes, or as women have historically done, in relief efforts for those affected, participation in cleanup, and filling support roles to help with those efforts. Women used to carry a lot of social responsibility, as men's strength and compassion and their status as protectors and providers were recognized as resources. A responsible woman didn't put herself, or the men responsible for protecting and providing for her, in a position to have to lightly use that strength or compassion, demonstrate that protector status, or overfill that provider role. She didn't abuse resources. A responsible woman recognized the cost at which men marshaled those resources, and she carefully stewarded them. To do that, she not only had to exercise personal accountability, but also responsibility for her community, including a responsibility to take a rational approach to social issues, particularly those involving personal reputation, as well as the behavior of other women. Women built social norms around not making it harder or more dangerous for men to be their strong, compassionate protectors and providers. This is something that has been severely diminished, if not unfortunately lost, in today's female society. Much of it was killed by feminism's dogma, which at its core is just opposition to standards for personal accountability among women. In particular, it is a rewrite of women's social role to exclude responsibility for how women treat men, and to excuse ignoring what strain women place on the resources represented by men's strength and men's role as protectors. Women still demand that men fill these roles, but take no responsibility whatsoever to refrain from making themselves a hindrance or to act as social protectors of men. This change has greatly polluted the social environment of our communities with sickening, crippling impact. We cannot have peace and cannot build prosperity to the best of our ability while factions of women are busy pitting factions of men against each other over women's conflicting personal interests. We talk a lot about the responsibilities men take in our society, but we really need to have a conversation about the responsibilities women should be taking. Women have a high degree of power over men's exercise of strength and compassion, particularly in their fulfillment of their role as protectors. In the modern era, it has become all too common for women to wantonly exploit and abuse that power to the detriment of everyone. We're told power corrupts, but this is not true. Selfishness, narcissism, laziness, and jealousy corrupt. Power just amplifies that corruption. There is only one real cure for that. Like Stan Lee taught the world through his characters, with great power comes great responsibility. It is time women stepped up and exercised that responsibility. Stop making the personal political, especially where human rights interests intersect with feminine egos. Responsible women do not get offended at the idea of a society that holds violent women as accountable for their behavior as we hold violent men for theirs. Responsible women do not call it misogyny to recognize the role of a woman's choices in bringing about the consequences of her chosen behavior. Responsible women are not scandalized by others' compassion for any man harmed or put at risk of harm by a woman's behavior and its consequences, and responsible women do not tolerate such solipsistic buffoonery in the women around them. We recognize that we are contributing to the composition of a social environment that affects all of the people in our communities. We take care with the quality of what we choose to contribute, and we don't dump a load of crap into that soup. This week, HBR Talk will discuss the role of women in the creation and perpetuation of social and legal standards that affect men, and the role women must take in reforming standards that have proven discriminatory and destructive. We stream on multiple platforms. You can tune in to the live stream on YouTube via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options on BadgerFeed.com and HoneyBadgerBrigade.com.